John hated mornings. Not because of waking up early, but because of one small thing that made his blood boil: his parking spot. Every morning, he parked in the same place, right in front of his apartment. It was perfect. Close to his door, shaded by a tree, and safe. But for the last few weeks, it seemed like the universe had decided to punish him. The first time it happened, John thought it was an accident. Some stranger must have parked there by mistake. But then it happened again. And again. And every time, the car in his spot wasn't just any car, it was a shiny black Porsche. Expensive. Flashy. And always driven by the same person. John frowned as he looked out of his window. Sure enough, there it was, gleaming in the morning sun, taking up the one thing he could always count on. He sighed and shook his head. Not again, he muttered to himself. The driver of that Porsche was no ordinary neighbor. He was the son of HOA Karen. Everyone in the building knew about Karen. She was the type of woman who loved rules more than people, but only when it suited her. Her son, Derek, was the perfect mix of arrogance and privilege. He knew he could do anything and get away with it. And apparently, parking in someone else's spot was one of those things. John remembered the first time he tried to confront Derek. He had walked outside calmly, ready to ask politely if he could park elsewhere. But as soon as he opened his mouth, Derek smirked, revved his Porsche engine, and drove off without saying a word. It was humiliating, but John didn't let it show. He closed his door slowly, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. That morning was no different. John grabbed his coffee and went out to check the spot. The Porsche was there again, and Derek was leaning against it, scrolling on his phone, completely oblivious to anyone else. John felt his stomach tighten. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Maybe today will be different, he whispered. He was wrong. As John walked past the car, Derek looked up and gave him a lazy, mocking smile. Hey, John, he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. Parking spots aren't really yours, you know. John clenched his fists but didn't say anything. He just kept walking, letting Derek have his moment. But inside, a fire was starting to burn. He couldn't let this go on forever. Back in his apartment, John sat at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee. The steam rose slowly, and he imagined it curling around the Porsche outside, mocking him. He had always been patient, always tried to follow the rules, but this was testing him. Day after day, Derek's audacity grew, and the HOA did nothing. Karen, of course, pretended to be unaware. John's mind raced. What could he do? Call the HOA? They would probably say it's a minor dispute and do nothing. Confront Derek again? He already knew that wouldn't work. Derek was too arrogant, too confident, too untouchable. And then, an idea began to form. Not a full plan yet, but a thought. What if there was a way to make Derek understand that parking in someone else's spot had consequences? The thought was dangerous, but it made John's heart beat faster. Maybe, just maybe, he could send a message without breaking the rules too badly. But for now, all he could do was wait. Watch. And hope that today, something would change. He went about his morning routine, trying to act normal, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. The Porsche was still there, and Derek was still smirking. John took another sip of coffee and muttered under his breath, "This ends soon." Little did he know, the day was only beginning, and what would happen next would be something he could never forget. The quiet mornings, the calm streets, the peaceful apartment, they were all about to change. And Derek? He had no idea that his actions were about to catch up with him in a way he would never expect. John didn't know when exactly he would act, but one thing was certain: his patience had a limit. And Derek, with his flashy car and careless attitude, had just reached it. As the sun climbed higher, the streets filled with neighbors heading to work, children laughing on the sidewalks, and life moving on like nothing had happened. But John's mind was only on one thing: that Porsche in his spot. And deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about respect, fairness, and finally standing up for himself. And in the quiet of his apartment, John made a silent promise. One way or another, Derek would learn. John thought yesterday had been bad. But today was worse. He stepped out of his apartment building, carrying his coffee like a shield against the world. The sun was just rising, casting a soft golden glow on the parking lot. Usually, he would feel calm, even a little proud, walking toward his spot first thing in the morning. But today, as he approached, he froze. There it was. The Porsche. Again. But this time, it wasn't just parked carelessly, it was parked crooked, taking up half of 2 spots, making it impossible for anyone else to fit. And, of course, Derek was leaning against it, sunglasses on, music blasting from the car, completely unaware or maybe completely unconcerned about John's existence. Unbelievable, John muttered, grinding his teeth. He wasn't just frustrated. He was starting to feel something heavier, something like anger mixed with disbelief. How could someone be so rude? So reckless? So untouchable? Hey, John! Derek called, waving lazily as if he had just spotted a neighbor at a garden party. Morning! John ignored him and kept walking. But the closer he got, the louder Derek's laugh became. He looked like he was enjoying this, like it was a game. And maybe it was, for Derek. Today, John decided not to confront him directly. He had tried before. Polite words, calm tones, logical explanations. Nothing worked. Derek didn't care about logic. He didn't care about rules. He only cared about looking cool, being above everyone else, and showing off his Porsche. But John wasn't just going to stand there anymore. He had an idea, a small, harmless start. Something to shake things up, to make Derek feel that parking in someone else's spot wasn't a free pass. He walked back to his apartment and grabbed a small traffic cone from his storage. It wasn't fancy. It was a cheap, orange plastic cone, a leftover from some old DIY project. But in John's mind, it was the first weapon in his arsenal. Returning to the parking lot, he carefully placed the cone right behind the Porsche's rear tires. Just a little obstacle. Nothing dangerous. Nothing illegal. Just a reminder, hey, someone is watching. Derek noticed immediately. His sunglasses tilted down slightly, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. He looked at John, then at the cone, then back at John. What the, he said, but before he could finish, John turned and walked away. It was a small victory. But John felt a rush of satisfaction. He had made his presence known without causing real damage. As he walked to his car, he noticed a few neighbors staring from their windows. Some were curious. Some were amused. No one spoke, but the silent support was enough to boost his confidence. Over the next few days, the situation escalated even more. Derek's arrogance grew bolder. One morning, John arrived to find not only his spot taken but also a reserved sign that Derek had scrawled on a piece of cardboard. He had written, Derek's spot, VIP only. John blinked. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. Then he laughed angrily. He had never seen such audacity. It was like Derek was challenging him, daring him to react. John tried reasoning again. He knocked on Derek's door. No answer. Left a polite note under the windshield wiper. No response. Every attempt failed. Derek was untouchable, untamed, and completely unbothered. One day, John watched as Derek invited a few friends over. They all laughed and joked, circling the Porsche like it was a trophy. Derek's friends took selfies with it, posting on social media, tagging the neighborhood. John felt his stomach tighten. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of Derek's dominance over the shared space. The tipping point came when Derek did something unthinkable. He parked so close to John's car that he couldn't get in without scratching it. Then he leaned on his horn, mocking John as he tried to squeeze in. That was it. Something inside John snapped. He retreated to his apartment, pacing back and forth. He needed a plan. Not a small one, not a harmless one. A plan that would finally make Derek understand. The frustration, the humiliation, the daily insult, it had all built up like a pressure cooker, and now it was ready to explode. John's mind raced. He imagined every possible scenario. What could he do that would get Derek's attention? Something that was clever, satisfying, and, most importantly, memorable. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the parking lot, John looked at the Porsche through his window. Derek was inside, laughing with his friends, completely oblivious. And John knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the game would change. And somewhere deep down, John couldn't help but smile. Because for the first time, he felt like he had the upper hand, at least, in his own mind. The next morning, John woke up with a sense of unease. His stomach was tight, like he was about to step into a battlefield. Today wasn't just another day. Today, he decided to confront Derek face to face. Not with notes, not with cones, not with quiet frustration. But in person. He brewed his coffee slowly, letting the steam fill the kitchen, trying to calm his nerves. He ran through what he would say. Polite, firm, clear. No yelling, no drama. Just facts. His spot, Derek's repeated offenses, the rules. But the more he rehearsed, the more he realized Derek might not listen. He wasn't a reasonable person. Derek was a showman, someone who thrived on attention and chaos. Still, John had to try. Stepping outside, he saw the familiar sight, the Porsche, parked boldly in his spot. Derek was already there, leaning casually against the hood, sunglasses on, phone in hand. The sun glinted off the car's polished surface, making it look almost untouchable. Derek noticed John immediately and gave him that infuriating smirk. "Morning, John," Derek said casually, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. "Nice day, huh?" John clenched his fists but forced a smile. "Derek, we need to talk," he said, keeping his voice steady. Derek laughed lightly, the sound mocking, playful, dangerous. "Talk? About what? Parking? Come on, it's just a spot." "It's not just a spot," John said firmly. "It's my spot. I've been patient, but this keeps happening. You can't just take it whenever you feel like it." Derek shrugged, leaning back, as if John's words were invisible. "Relax, man. It's not a big deal. There are other spots, you know." John's patience cracked. He took a deep breath. "It is a big deal. I follow the rules. You don't. It's not fair, and I'm tired of being ignored." For a moment, Derek paused, as if considering him. Then he laughed louder, a cruel, careless laugh that echoed in the parking lot. "Ignored? Me? You're funny, John. You take life way too seriously." John felt the heat rise to his face. He had expected arrogance, but this blatant mockery was more than he could handle. He wanted to shout, to push, to make Derek understand in a way that words never could. But instead, he stayed calm, controlling his anger. He had something else in mind. Something clever. Something that would get through to Derek without breaking the law, too badly. "I'm done asking nicely," John said, his voice low but firm. "If you keep taking my spot, there will be consequences. Real consequences. You won't just get away with it anymore." Derek tilted his head, a little confused now. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Usually, John just walked away, quietly fuming. But today was different. Today, John's eyes were steady, determined, unshakable. "Consequences?" Derek said, feigning curiosity. "What do you mean?" John didn't answer immediately. He just stared at him, letting the silence stretch. Derek shifted uncomfortably. The air between them felt charged, like something could ignite at any second. "You'll see," John finally said, turning and walking toward his apartment. He didn't look back. Derek's smirk faltered for just a moment. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. "Not like this?" The neighbors watched silently from their windows. Some whispered to each other. Some leaned closer, curious about the confrontation. No one had ever seen John act like this. No one had ever dared challenge Derek in person. As John closed his door, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and fear. He had made his point, he wasn't someone to be ignored, but he also knew that Derek wouldn't back down. This was a new phase in their battle. The stakes were higher now. All day, John thought about the confrontation. Derek's laughter, his careless attitude, the way he leaned against the Porsche like it was untouchable. John imagined ways to get even, small actions at first, testing boundaries, planning the idea that Derek couldn't just do whatever he wanted. That evening, John went outside again, not to confront Derek, but to watch. The Porsche gleamed in the fading sunlight, parked arrogantly in the middle of the lot. Derek was inside, scrolling on his phone, oblivious. But John noticed something subtle. Derek glanced around more than usual, like he felt eyes on him. A small, victorious smile crossed John's face. It wasn't over. Far from it. But today, he had made Derek think. Even if only for a moment, the arrogant showman had felt a tiny crack in his untouchable persona. Tomorrow would be another day. And John had plans. Clever plans. Plans that would push the confrontation further, force Derek to face consequences in a way he had never imagined. And as the sun disappeared behind the apartment buildings, casting long shadows over the parking lot, John made a silent promise. Derek had underestimated him once. But he wouldn't underestimate him again. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. This was about respect, about standing up, and about finally making Derek understand that actions have consequences. And deep down, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, excitement. Because the real game was just beginning. The day after his confrontation, John couldn't focus on anything. His mind kept drifting back to Derek, to that Porsche, to the way the arrogant smirk had barely faltered when he finally stood up. That tiny crack in Derek's confidence, it was enough to spark something in John. He knew that confrontation alone wouldn't solve the problem. Not yet. He needed a plan. A clever one. Something that would get Derek's attention in a way he would never forget. John sat at his kitchen table, notebook open, pen in hand, and coffee cooling beside him. He started listing ideas. Nothing too reckless, he wasn't crazy, but ideas that could shake Derek, just enough to make him think twice about taking John's spot again. The first idea was too simple, a note, signed parking enforcement. Too obvious, too weak. Derek would laugh, maybe even brag about it. The second idea was better, a harmless prank. Maybe some cones around the car, or a small obstacle. But that had already been tried. Derek had barely noticed. John frowned, tapping the pen against the paper. He needed something smarter. Something unexpected. And then it hit him. Derek loved attention, loved showing off. What if John used that against him? What if he made Derek believe that the whole neighborhood was watching, that everyone knew what he was doing, that his arrogance had consequences? A slow, satisfied smile spread across John's face. That was it. Not direct confrontation. Not illegal action. Just clever psychological pressure. He started thinking about the details. First, he would create small hints, little signs that Derek was being noticed. A plastic cone here, a reserved sign there, subtle enough to confuse him but obvious enough to make him paranoid. Derek would feel watched. He would start questioning himself. Next, John planned to use neighbors subtly. He didn't need anyone to actually confront Derek, just enough to make him feel that he wasn't alone, that his behavior wasn't going unnoticed. A neighbor walking past and giving a knowing look. A small comment about parking etiquette. Derek would notice these small things and start feeling uncomfortable. John wrote everything down, each step carefully. He knew patience would be key. One mistake, one hasty move, and Derek would be more reckless, more defensive. He needed Derek to underestimate him until the final moment. But John didn't stop there. He began imagining the final stage, the part that would make Derek learn the lesson once and for all. It couldn't be too aggressive, not illegal. But it had to be clever, unforgettable. The Porsche wasn't just a car, it was Derek's ego. And John had to touch that ego to make his point. As he scribbled ideas, John's mind wandered to Derek's habits. He knew the car was never locked for long when Derek left it briefly to grab coffee or chat with friends. He knew Derek checked his phone constantly, distracted, careless. He knew the son of HOA Karen thrived on arrogance, not caution. That knowledge was power. By the time the sun began to set, John had a clear picture in his mind. The plan wasn't fully ready yet, he needed to watch, test, and adjust. But he knew one thing for certain: patience and precision would win this game. Not rage, not confrontation, not anger. Just clever, strategic action. He leaned back in his chair, thinking about Derek laughing yesterday, thinking about the Porsche parked crookedly in his spot, thinking about how every neighbor had noticed but no one dared to intervene. Derek thought he was untouchable. He thought no one could challenge him. John smiled. Let him think that. Let him feel safe, arrogant, untouchable. That was when the final move would hit the hardest. That night, John set up a small watch station near his window. He had a clear view of the parking lot and Derek's Porsche. Not to spy, not to invade privacy, just to observe. Timing, he reminded himself, would be everything. He needed to know Derek's patterns, the small habits, the moments of carelessness. That information would be the key to the plan's success. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, John felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was no longer about a parking spot. This was about strategy, about finally standing up and making Derek understand that actions have consequences. It was about patience, cleverness, and timing. And in the quiet of the apartment, the Porsche gleamed under the streetlights, still oblivious to the storm brewing around it. Derek, confident and arrogant as ever, had no idea that the game had just begun and that the next few days would change everything. John knew one thing for sure: the plan was forming, and when it was ready, Derek would wish he had never taken that parking spot. The next morning, John woke up early, before the sun had even fully risen. He felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Today was the day. The day his plan would finally start to work. His notebook of strategies lay open on the kitchen table, each step carefully written. Every detail mattered. Timing, patience, precision, this was his moment. He grabbed a cup of coffee and peeked out the window. The parking lot was quiet, empty except for a few early risers. And then he saw it, the Porsche, parked boldly in his spot, just as usual. Derek was nowhere in sight, probably still inside or rushing to get coffee. Perfect. Timing was on John's side. He stepped outside slowly, carrying a small backpack. Inside were the first tools of his plan: a bright traffic cone, a reserve sign he had prepared, and a small bottle of chalk. Not dangerous, not illegal, just enough to make Derek notice, enough to make him think twice. John approached the Porsche carefully, glancing around. The neighbors' windows were dark, streets quiet. He didn't want attention, not yet. Placing the cone behind the car's rear tires, he whispered to himself, "Step 1, done." A small victory, but an important one. Derek needed to feel watched. Next, he carefully chalked a subtle line near the tires. It looked like nothing at first glance, just a faint marking on the asphalt. But John knew that if Derek parked in the same crooked way again, the chalk would show exactly how reckless he was being. As John stepped back, he felt a thrill. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. Then he heard footsteps. Derek's sneakers on the pavement, light but confident. Derek appeared, sunglasses on, coffee in hand, probably thinking the morning would be just like any other. "Morning, John," Derek said casually, flashing that arrogant smirk. "Busy today?" John didn't answer. He just nodded slightly, keeping his eyes on the Porsche. Derek followed his gaze and noticed the cone, then the faint chalk markings. His smirk faltered. What's this?" Derek asked, feigning confusion but clearly concerned. John took a step closer. "Just a little reminder," he said calmly. "About the rules. About respect. About consequences." Derek laughed, a little nervous this time. You're overreacting. It's just a parking spot. John shook his head. It's not just a spot. It's my spot. And I'm tired of being ignored. Derek hesitated, scanning the surroundings. For the first time, he seemed slightly uncomfortable. He didn't understand fully yet, but he sensed that John was serious, that something had changed. Whatever, Derek said finally, shrugging, and leaned on the Porsche. I'll move if I feel like it. John's heart raced. This was the moment to escalate. He pulled out the small reserve sign and planted it gently behind the cone. Now, anyone passing by could see the mark. Someone was paying attention. Derek's arrogance might crumble when he noticed others watching. And then John retreated to his hidden spot by the window, the vantage point he had set up days ago. From there, he could see everything: Derek, the Porsche, the parking lot. He waited silently. The tension was almost unbearable. Derek paced around the car, checking the markings, the cone, the sign. He squinted at the asphalt, running a hand through his hair. John could barely contain his satisfaction. Derek's confidence was cracking, just like he had hoped. Then Derek's phone buzzed. A friend had sent a picture, noticing the unusual setup. Derek glanced around nervously. He realized that for the first time, people were watching him. People were noticing his arrogance. John's heart pounded. The plan was working. Derek's mind raced, trying to figure out if this was an accident, a prank, or something more. He didn't know. And that uncertainty, precisely what John had intended, was more powerful than confrontation. John leaned back, sipping his coffee, letting Derek stew in his confusion. He didn't need to do anything else yet. Derek was already questioning himself, already feeling the pressure of consequences he had never imagined. By mid-morning, Derek finally moved the Porsche. Slowly, reluctantly, almost ashamedly, he parked in another spot, carefully avoiding the cone and chalk markings. John could barely hide his triumphant smile. Step 1 of the plan was a success. Derek had noticed. Derek had reacted. And most importantly, Derek had started to feel the consequences of his arrogance. But John knew this was only the beginning. Derek's pride would push him to test limits again. The real challenge, the moment when the plan reached its peak, was still ahead. For now, though, John allowed himself a small victory. He had taken action, and it had worked. Derek, the untouchable, arrogant son of HOA Karen, had felt a crack in his armor. And that crack would grow, piece by piece, until the lesson was unforgettable. As John watched the Porsche settle into its new spot, he whispered quietly to himself, "This isn't over." Not even close. And somewhere in the distance, Derek probably didn't know it yet, but his mornings would never feel the same again. The next morning, John woke up with a mix of excitement and nerves. After days of careful planning, subtle pranks, and psychological games, today would show the real results of his efforts. He didn't know exactly what would happen, but he knew Derek would feel it. He would finally face the consequences of his arrogance. Peeking out the window, John saw the familiar sight, the Porsche. Derek was nowhere in sight yet, probably still inside or running late. The parking lot was quiet, almost too quiet, adding to the suspense. John grabbed his coffee and watched, heart pounding, as if waiting for the first domino to fall. Moments later, Derek emerged, carrying a bag of takeout and humming to himself. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual. But as he approached the Porsche, his expression changed. The cone from yesterday had been moved slightly, the chalk markings more noticeable now in the morning sunlight, and the reserve sign had somehow shifted, leaning perfectly against the curb. Derek stopped in his tracks, frowning. "What the?" he muttered, stepping closer. He circled the car, inspecting it, checking the surroundings. John watched silently from his window, a small, satisfied smile forming on his face. Derek's arrogance was cracking faster than he expected. Then something happened that John hadn't fully anticipated. A few neighbors, curious from the previous days, had come outside for their morning routines. They noticed the cone, the sign, and the chalk markings. One of them, an older lady from the corner apartment, gave Derek a knowing look and a small nod. Derek froze. His confident smirk faltered. He wasn't used to being watched. Not like this. His eyes darted around, checking for more witnesses. Suddenly, he realized that the entire parking lot seemed aware of him, and for the first time, he felt exposed, vulnerable. John felt a thrill. The plan was working, even better than he had imagined. Derek was starting to feel the pressure. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that actions had consequences and that arrogance alone couldn't protect him. But the real consequence came a few minutes later. As Derek tried to maneuver the Porsche out of the spot, he misjudged the angle. The rear bumper nudged the cone John had placed. It made a loud scraping sound. Derek's face went pale. The neighbors gasped quietly, some stifling laughter. Derek cursed under his breath, trying to adjust the car carefully, but the damage was done. The cone had scratched the paint slightly. John felt a mix of shock and satisfaction. He hadn't intended for physical contact, but it was minor enough to send a message without being destructive. Derek's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. He slammed the door and stormed back into his apartment, muttering angrily. From his window, John could see the tension. Derek's hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. He was furious but also aware that the neighbors had noticed. His pride had been bruised, publicly. The news of the incident spread quickly. By mid-morning, whispers circulated in the building. "Did you see Derek today? Something happened with his Porsche. I think someone is finally teaching him a lesson." John stayed quiet, observing the ripple effect. His plan had gone beyond the car. It was affecting Derek's image, his reputation, and his confidence. By afternoon, Derek avoided the parking lot. He parked farther away, carefully, almost timidly. John could barely hide his satisfaction. The arrogant, untouchable young man was shaken. His morning routine had been disrupted, his pride hurt, and for the first time, he realized that John wasn't someone to ignore. But the consequences weren't just external. John noticed a subtle change in Derek's behavior over the next few days. He walked faster, avoided eye contact, and seemed preoccupied, checking the lot more than usual. The psychological impact was clear. The plan had worked perfectly. John, meanwhile, felt a mixture of pride and reflection. He had succeeded in sending a message without crossing serious lines. He had been clever, patient, and strategic. But he also understood that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about fairness, respect, and standing up for himself. That evening, as John watched the sun set over the parking lot, he noticed Derek peeking from behind his blinds, cautiously observing the cone, the chalk lines, and the empty spot. John smiled quietly. The game wasn't over, but Derek had learned something important. He could no longer act without consequence. John realized that the consequences weren't just for Derek. They were for the neighborhood, for the shared respect that had been ignored for too long. He had set an example without creating chaos, without breaking rules. And that, more than anything, gave him a quiet sense of victory. As the night fell, the Porsche sat parked, carefully aligned, untouched. Derek was inside, probably plotting his next move, probably feeling the sting of the lesson he hadn't expected. And John knew one thing for sure: when the final act came, it would be unforgettable. The stage was set. The players were in position. And the final part of the story, the ultimate resolution, was just around the corner. The days after the incident with the cone and chalk lines were strangely quiet. Derek parked farther away, carefully, almost timidly, and John watched from his window with a sense of cautious satisfaction. The arrogant young man who had once dominated the parking lot with his Porsche was no longer untouchable. He had felt the consequences, both physically and psychologically. But John knew the story wasn't finished yet. Victory was sweet, but he wanted the lesson to stick. He wanted Derek, and maybe even his mother, HOA Karen, to understand that repeated disrespect could not be ignored. That evening, John walked down to the parking lot, coffee in hand, under the soft orange glow of the streetlights. The Porsche was parked neatly, the cone removed, the chalk gone. It looked ordinary, but John's mind saw the tension that lingered inside Derek. The boy had learned, but pride still ran deep. As John approached the car, Derek appeared from behind his apartment door, frowning, arms crossed. "John, what are you doing?" he asked cautiously, almost suspiciously. "Just walking," John replied casually, hiding the sense of victory bubbling inside him. "Enjoying the evening." Derek studied him silently, clearly unsure how to act. The arrogance that had defined him for weeks was replaced by something else, uncertainty. The young man realized that John wasn't just another neighbor to be ignored. He was clever, patient, and willing to act when pushed. You made it clear," Derek muttered finally. "Okay, I get it. I won't take your spot again." John nodded slowly. "Good. That's all I wanted." His voice was calm, neutral, but the satisfaction underneath was undeniable. Derek didn't argue, didn't try to joke. He simply nodded, walked around the Porsche, and parked it carefully in a nearby empty spot. John felt a strange mix of relief and pride. The confrontation had escalated to a psychological game, small but clever, and it had worked. Derek had learned the lesson in a way that wouldn't involve major damage, legal trouble, or anyone else's interference. But the resolution wasn't just about Derek. Over the next few days, John noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. People who had once ignored Derek's arrogance now smiled politely, waved, and sometimes even nodded knowingly. It was as if the balance of respect had shifted. The little victory had rippled outward, creating a small, quiet sense of order. John thought back to the confrontation, the subtle plan, the small but effective execution. He realized that the true power of his actions wasn't in revenge, it was in cleverness, patience, and standing up for himself without crossing the line. He had turned frustration into strategy, anger into results, and isolation into influence. That night, John sat by his window, looking at the parking lot. The Porsche was there, but now it was just another car. Derek had learned boundaries. The neighbors had noticed. And John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: control over his own space, pride in doing the right thing, and satisfaction without destruction. Yet, he knew this story would stay with him. It wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about respect, strategy, patience, and understanding how small actions could have large consequences. Derek had learned a hard lesson, and John had proven to himself that cleverness and calm determination could win over arrogance. The next morning, John stepped outside as usual, coffee in hand, and noticed something remarkable. Derek parked in his own spot, carefully, no smirks, no arrogance. For the first time, John felt a deep sense of peace. The battle had ended, not with rage, not with chaos, but with quiet resolution. As he walked past the Porsche, Derek gave him a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Respect had been restored, subtly but clearly. And in that moment, John understood that this small victory was bigger than the parking lot, bigger than the Porsche. It was about self-respect, patience, and standing firm without losing control. Later, when John returned to his apartment, he sat down at his table, notebook in hand. He reflected on the past few days, the tension, the clever moves, the small victories, and realized that he had grown too. He wasn't just fighting for a parking spot, he had learned patience, observation, and strategy. He had learned that sometimes, subtlety and clever planning could achieve what confrontation alone could not. And somewhere behind his window, Derek's Porsche gleamed in the morning light, parked perfectly, humbly, as if it too had learned the lesson. John smiled quietly. The game was over, the lesson had been learned, and the neighborhood had changed, even if just a little. And in that small, ordinary moment, he felt extraordinary. He had turned frustration into strategy, chaos into order, and arrogance into respect. The parking spot was his again, not because he had forced it, not because he had broken rules, but because he had acted wisely, patiently, and cleverly. And in that quiet victory, John knew one thing for certain: cleverness always wins over arrogance, if only you wait for the right moment.